Okay. Good evening. My name is Mamie Ang. I'm the director here at the Henry Waldinger Library in Valley Stream. This is our regular book club meeting, and every month we try to get an author to come speak about the book. This month, we are discussing the book Hollow Spaces, and the author is Victor Suthammanont.
Suthammanont.
Suthammanont. Okay. Um, and he's very gracious to come speak to us. I hope that you had enough chance to read the book because we did have a trouble getting copies for everybody. So Victor is a lawyer, so there was a lot of legal information here, and I know Irving is a lawyer, so I don't know if Irving will be speaking up. So um, why don't you give us a little background of why you just are you still practicing law, and are you doing just writing right now?
Sure. Yes, I am still practicing law. I practice at a boutique firm called Suthammanont LLP in New York City. Up until January of this year, I had worked for the United States Securities and Exchange Commission, and I had done that for 10 years. I was in primarily during those 10 years a lawyer in the enforcement division, investigating and litigating the commission's cases against people the commission accused of, for example, securities fraud or rules violations, things like that. The last 2.5 years I was at the commission, I worked directly for the chair of the commission as his enforcement counsel. And before that, I had worked at a big Wall Street law firm and clerked in a federal court, appeals court. And so, yeah, I've been a lawyer for about 20 years, and I'm still practicing.
So, this book, then, what inspired you to decide to write a book? And this did not seem to be about your legal background, though.
No, it did not. I think I came to it through two different ideas that had been sitting in my mind for a long time. And just by way of background for context for this part of it is, I've been writing since high school. I was the editor of my high school literary magazine. And then I went to NYU for acting for college before I went to law school. And so I was writing then plays, screenplays, and things. So I've been writing for a long time. And I had this idea in my head about um, the idea of inheritance in the form of the, what we take from our parents, what we give on to our children, and especially as I got older and I had two sons, that those ideas that both sides of that, thinking about what I had learned from my dad and the things I had taken from him and the things I'd passed on to my sons, and same thing with my mom, obviously. Um, that idea had been there, and then the idea of like, what if there was something so terrible that somebody did that children had to live with that, and what does that mean? And at the same time, or around the same time, I read a story in the New York Times about a man in upstate New York who had been acquitted of murder. And there was a quote in the story that he had given that was along the lines of like, yeah, I was acquitted, but everybody here thinks I did it. And part of the story was just how this town continued to believe he had maybe committed this crime. And at some point, I realized they were the same story in my mind. Like those two things went together, and that's how I had the big idea for Hollow Spaces.
But this story, there, it went over a span of what, 30 years, basically?
Yeah.
And do you feel that? Well, I'm trying to think. Um, I guess nowadays people are going into back to, with all the podcasts and everything, people bring back old cases. But back in the day, a case was finished, and not that many people would investigate, I guess, or be that concerned about the outcome.
Yeah, I don't know that I could point to evidence, but I feel like the idea of cold cases and um, people looking back in time at cold cases is pretty much something I think I remember growing up with or seeing at the time. But definitely in the sense of obviously 30 years ago, you know, at the time of John's story, it's not a cold case, right? It's happening at the time. And then nowadays, the children thinking back, um, do go back and think about that. And you read stories, if you're reading as much as I do in terms of the paper, and especially legal stuff, where every so often, 3 times a year, the New York Times will run a story about some crime that was unsolved, or some journalist will do, in some online magazine or whatever, a long form piece on. There was one today actually about a crime, a murder somewhere in, I want to say, Oregon. That was a cold case that they were trying to reinvestigate recently, and from the 80s, that got killed because of the program cuts that the Trump administration's imposed on different things. And so even today there was an article about a cold case. So I think that the idea of, and I think those stories resonate, right? Because in some ways we look to the justice system and the trials to tell us the truth of what happened in something, right? And that's why I think I started the story the way I did with the end of it, because I really, being a lawyer, you see like the verdict is a verdict, but it's there is imperfections in that, and in framing even our media around the idea that the trial gets to the truth of a matter. Yes, sometimes it does, but sometimes it doesn't. And so I really wanted to kind of start at the end and unpack a little bit what the gaps are in the justice system there, and the way we look at crime and things like that.
Well, as someone who's had jury duty several times, I've not one of my most favorite hack things, but um, I know that it is our our social civic duty, and the two cases that we had verdicts, I still think about it, and I just hope that we made the right verdict, but we never find out. So in this case, you kind of do find out, and you should be. I don't want to spoil this if anyone didn't finish. Okay, all right, but I know, like I think about it because one of the cases that I was involved with, and we convicted the person, and he got up and started screaming at us that he was going to come get us. So it was very dramatic. Um, so I'm glad that you pursued this, and you do bring up the topic that, even though a verdict can come, it's only as good as the case that's presented, and how at that moment in time, basically, because not everything's there at the time, and the police don't always get everything.
No, it's absolutely correct. I mean, you can look at the rules of evidence, and there's any number of things in the jury system and in trials in particular that are designed to, for example, ensure fairness, but also keep the whole truth, from coming to the jury, for example. And is that good or bad? I think it depends, but it is definitely a limit on telling a full truth.
Did you draw on then your legal background seems not be like criminal cases. Do you feel it was very different?
Yes and no. I mean, when I was with the government on the civil enforcement side, we often worked with, I did goodness knows how many investigations with, like, for example, the U.S. Attorney's offices, in New York, both the Southern District and Eastern District, and other criminal investigators in criminal investigative agencies. So I had a good sense from that, and so the criminal side of it, the procedure side is not completely foreign to me. And the substantive law of it is easy enough. Particularly in this case, a murder is pretty straightforward in terms of what the issues are there. Um, so that I didn't feel like I had to stretch, and honestly, I wanted to write about something that was different than what I was doing in my day job. Like, for a number of reasons. So I felt like this was a much more interesting story, and especially in context of telling John's story, the father's story, and how it related back to. There's a lot. It's more than just the legal drama in this book, right? There's a lot about their personal life and who they are and their marriages, and I really the way I wrote it almost in my mind as literary fiction, and then in the guise of a mystery or a legal drama, you know?
Now, obviously, John was Chinese,
Correct.
right? And do you think that the fact that he was married to, I would assume, a Caucasian, and then the children were then of mixed, do you feel that that played a part in the perception of John, how people perceived him?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's been, um, I think back in my lifetime of growing up, and again, I'm mixed race, right? I'm half Asian. But I look at my dad and the kind of things he faced and stories he told me about, being in the United States. And he was John's Asian American in the sense he was born here, right? My dad immigrated, but you know, looking at the experience of my father, for example, and the kind of challenges and racism he faced, which were both similar to the kind of racism and challenges I face, but different. And granted, as the world evolved between the 1970s, 80s till today, for the most part, I would say it improved for me and for him. Although he passed when I was writing the book during the early stages of COVID. I think the present day, I might argue that maybe we're seeing a regression in terms of the way racism is much more tolerated and accepted around the world, around the country. And so maybe John's story is much more timely than I had hoped it would be. But I also wanted to address the complexities about you know the particular challenges Asian Americans face versus, let's say, someone who's black or Latino. And there's a scene early on in the book when John's walking back, and I really crafted that scene purposefully. Right, he is an accused criminal for murder, and he's walking down the street, and there's a white woman there who's trying to avoid a black man in a suit, and there's racism in all kinds of different ways, and it's not the oppression Olympics as some people might say, but it really is. There's a lot of nuance to the way racism plays out in the United States, and even in New York City, which is a fairly, one thinks of it as a fairly tolerant, should be a tolerant city with so many different people here, but sometimes it's not. I've walked down the streets of New York City and had people saying wild things to me. Yeah. um, and so there is that.
Um, Reginald put something in the chat. I mean, I don't know if have the ability to turn on your mic, but he did say that that was a scene that resonated with him too.
Well, I'm
uh,
glad.
yeah. Well, I'm thinking like, okay, would I don't know if he hadn't had the affair with Jessica, um, whether he would have been like the target to be framed. But I feel that because he was a Chinese American, having the quote audacity to have an affair with a white person made him a good scapegoat person.
Oh,
You know,
absolutely. I mean, my father married a white woman, and I remember the stories he told me about being with her when they were young and walking around, and then things people would say to her and him about it. And that definitely influenced the choice there. I also thought about, you know, I didn't beat on this point in the book, but it definitely is something where, for example, I think there has been in the last 20 years a series of prosecutions against Chinese scientists and professors for spying for China, for example. And there are allegations that those prosecutions and investigations are rooted in some kind of anti-Chinese racism because they're just, hypothetically rooted in a presumption that if you're Chinese, you're still, owing this allegiance to China. And again, I'm not taking a position on any of those cases. I'm not, an expert in them, but I think there is some history of othering across races in America in terms of enabling the prosecution of any number of people. And I think you see it today in terms of the immigration crackdown, where, you would imagine having military on the street streets of American cities would be objectionable to a huge portion of the population. But I think it's people are obviously protesting and rising up, but it's the outcry is somewhat muted. I would, my opinion, by the fact that it's not people who necessarily look like me who are getting rounded up. So I think it's a huge problem.
To go on to know about the writing of your book, it was so, from what I've read, it seems to be so meticulously put together.
Thank you.
Is that your style?
Yeah, it's funny. I have this book was very challenging to write. So to get into the craft discussion, it is obviously with the dual timelines and cutting back and forth, kind of complex structurally, just as a matter of that. And when I was writing it, initially I wrote it the way it appears in the book right now, where I wrote a chapter for John and some of John's story, and then for the kids, and then back and forth. And that got very, very hard to do, mainly because I didn't know anything about who did it. I hadn't made that decision yet. I honestly wrote, well, I'll tell you this in a second. So then what I did is I broke it apart. So then I wrote John's entire story, and then I wrote the kid's story 30 years later. So I just wrote it sequentially and then mixed them back together. But the funny thing about doing it that way was I honestly hadn't made a decision. I didn't know the ultimate answer, and I won't spoil it here in case people haven't finished it yet. But I mean, I wrote John's entire story and 80%, 90% of the kid's story without knowing um, uh, who did it, like what was the answer to the crime. Um, and so that was challenging and fun.
So that's actually the way it would have happened. They were investigating the crime, and then you started to throw in um, the results. So they
Precisely.
didn't know. Yeah, I get it now. Yes, that's very interesting.
Yeah,
Uh,
I because I figured, as a technical matter, to the extent I was incorporating mystery elements into it, right? It was this idea that they would discover clues as they went along, and there had to be red herrings, right? There's alternative suspects. Is it their dad? Is it these other people? And so I figured at some point I would just write enough clues that I would be like, oh yeah, this is it. And so it was an interesting way to do that. I'm just going to open the chat because I see people commenting, and I want to make sure I address anybody who has a question.
yeah, Reginald is asking some questions in the chat.
Yeah, but I also don't want to interrupt you. So
No, that's all right. I actually have to step away for a minute, so you can answer for Reginald.
you got it. So Reginald asks, for those of you who can't access the chat, I see somebody's on at least one phone line. He says, a question I came into the discussion with, actually, one of the things about your writing process from the discussion was that you yourself weren't decided on whether John had done it or not. I imagine that made it easier to write the story in a way that you didn't disclose it one way or the other, but once you decided, how much did you go back and change out of what you had already written? So yes, great question. Um, yes, in some ways it made it easier to write the story because with as a mystery, because I didn't know either. Um, and one of the things you have to do when writing a mystery is you have to be fair to the reader, I think, and give them a chance to solve it too. And so I couldn't just make up a fact at the end and be like, oh, here's something somebody always knew, and whatever, and that the reader, didn't have a chance to figure out whether it's in John's story or later, in the kid's story. So once I decided who had done it, ultimately, two things had to happen. One, in deciding the answer to that question, or if the reader finds out at all. I thought about a lot of ways that story could end, and the way you decide that was also like, if I say it's person X, this is what the story means. If it's Y, this is what it means, or people will think it means. So I wanted to decide based on that. But then when I went back, once I decided, I did go back and just make sure everything was consistent and tight, and I didn't have an outlying, inconsistent fact or something that was really bad. And then I think at some point during the editing process, my editor, he was like, "This part is too much; it gives it away, and this part there's not enough, so let's add a little bit more." So we did tweak a little, but it wasn't major. But it definitely made it easier to write John's story because I had to figure out a way to tell his story where John would know whether he did it or not. But how do you go through his life following the trial without him ever referring back to whether he did it? And that was an interesting project to do, but also shockingly kind of didn't it matters, but it doesn't to his story, so it worked out, I think.
Well, it becomes a story of the children,
Hmm.
you know, um, and how they're coping and what they're doing. So, um, yes, that I was to say that unknown was important. Otherwise, it kind of would it would kill the ending. That's for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, I definitely considered an ending where and I don't think this is spoiling too much. I think it'll take away people's anxiety because I've talked to other book clubs where they're like, I was really worried you would never tell us. I did think about that, but I decided I couldn't figure out a way to execute it and make it satisfying to the reader.
When you this is written as Hollow Spaces, a novel, okay? Because it's got so much more nuances. But a lot of these books, this is like a quote, a mystery, but because there's so much more depth in terms of the characters and stuff, I would feel that it's properly um, labeled as a novel. Yeah. 'Cause, you see a lot of these mysteries come in, they don't really have that development of the characters and the backgrounds. They it's just solving the crime, getting all of the facts together and finding who did it, the who done it, like, yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. So I was very, we have as a group have read many books, just all different types, mysteries and stuff. So I'm always looking for something different. So that's why it was when it came across my desk. It had a nice cover art now. I don't know if you can have control over it. It's very interesting. It's really very interesting what they do, and it does draw you in. But I am the one that does the cataloging, so I have to look at a little bit more. And I was reading it. It says, okay, it's not a mystery. It's not really a true mystery. Okay. Let me see. I'm gonna see if original added anything else. No. Okay. Do you have when you said you had an editor, is this something that you had to pitch, and how difficult was this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I got very lucky there, in terms of, I had written this book. We went out. My agent at the time, she has since gone in house to a publisher, and then another agent at her agency has picked me up. But we went out and shopped this book for a little bit, and uh, initially, I think because it kind of sits in that a weird place genre wise, it's not exactly a mystery or what people would who would pick up like your normal mystery would be like expecting. And because I'd written it as literary fiction, but that may not be the most commercial of things, and so I think there was some difficulty in terms of initially getting it sold, but eventually we found my editor Dan Lopez, who's at Counterpoint, and he got the book immediately, I think, and we had a call and talked about it. And his there's a senior editor there, Dan Smitanka, and they understood the project. They understand what I was trying to do. They understood the crossover, the fact that it's kind of a crossover book, and so that I just got super lucky with them because it made the editing process super easy with them, super enjoyable, very collaborative. The marketing team there has done such a good job with the cover, for example, and all of those things. They've been so wonderful to work with, and they put out Counterpoint puts out such a great catalog every year. I really have like enjoyed getting to know them as a publisher, and so yeah, but it made it, it was definitely challenging. It takes a while. Anybody who's ever tried to write, getting an agent, getting it published, all of those things is constant stream of no's for so long. Um, and luckily when I was, I guess 18 in my first week of acting school, they were like, "Hey, you're choosing a profession where people will say no to you 199 times out of 200. So if you're not ready for that, you shouldn't do it. But if you are going to do it, then you need to be ready to do a lot of work despite all the no's." And so um, I think all my careers have been kind of in that vein. Even lawyering, half the time the best you can do for your client is the least bad outcome. Like nothing happened, there's nothing good that's going to come out of any of this for you. The most I can do for you is like try to minimize like your damage. Um, and so, probably spend a lot of time beating my head against the wall.
So when you said that you had great editors, is were there? It is a pretty lengthy book. Were
Yeah.
there? Yeah, like 300 something pages is a lot. Um, are there chapters that were just like had to be cut out?
Shockingly, no. And by shockingly, I mean when we first had a conversation, the book, the way people in publishing talk about books is less pages than words. So I think I gave it to them at about 107 or 109,000 words. I forget the exact number. And most novels, especially debuts, they want them around 90,000 words. So I was like 19,000 words over the typical count. And so there was some discussion of like, was I willing to cut parts out of the book or cut it down? And I told them, I was open to the idea, but one of the reasons they enjoyed the book was the prose. I think I had done a good job just kind of like building, like the way it reads is what it is. And I said, if we start cutting or streamlining, is it going to be the same book that you love? But we had a conversation. We cut, like, I want to say 5,000 words throughout. We just streamlined certain scenes, tightened things up, but it wasn't like a whole scene came out or a whole section.
So there's no chapters then that you could do another book. This was finished. And what are your thoughts now? And like a lot of mysteries are sequels. There's no sequel to this. So are you if you're going to write now, you have to start all over again.
Yeah, no, I think this book is kind of a nice, concise things. Who knows? Maybe I'll have an idea about Brendan and Hunter's future life or something at some point. Or, I think one of the big things that's sad for me on the page at least is Jane's story. In terms of you only ever see her character through the John's eyes or the children's eyes, right? You never see kind of what was in her head or how it worked out. And that's partially because I knew I only had so many words to tell this story, and that if I tried to do a little bit with her, it would still feel incomplete. So I decided the better choice was to just not have her tell her story. And I have thought about, like what would her version of this be, but I think this story's done. I tend to play around in terms of next projects or things I'm thinking about. I like to play with this idea of starting at the end of something, or how do you take a genre piece and pull something different out of it. So, for example, with uh, I always like the idea of an action movie, but can you make an action movie or a thriller like that literary, for lack of a better term, right? What would what would the literary fiction version of John Wick look like? And so I don't know if anybody here has seen the John Wick movies, but like, and so I play with ideas like that, or science fiction. What if you did, um, you know, and a lot of these things and ideas come from just like random conversations I have that kind of stick with me, and I'm like, oh, maybe that would be fun. And so, yeah.
I just want to tell Reginald, the library just closed, so if you want to talk, you can feel free if you have a speaker. Okay, don't you know? Uh, Reginald's actually in another part of the library,
Got it.
All
and
right.
and we are closing, but he's staying in. You know, he can stay in to so finish the Zoom. Okay. So if you have any questions, please feel free to add. Um, and I don't know if Irving has anything to say. Um, and I'm not sure who this other person is. Is that Deborah? Yeah. So if you're not going to do add anything to this, your next, I assume this is going to be your next novel.
Yes. So I think the next novel is well, fingers crossed. We'll see. I think I don't want to I don't want to disclose anything yet, but I have a couple ideas for different things I'm working on. I'll give you a menu. One of them is this idea of like what would a literary fiction version of John Wick look like. One of them is an idea I had about a kid in a boarding school and meets a girl on the campus who goes missing. Um, I have another one that's an idea of like a science fiction heist movie like idea. And what was the other one? There's one I have an idea about that is kind of the ship of Theseus. If anybody knows what that is, if you replace every part on the ship of Theseus, is it still Theseus's ship? But if you take that and apply it to the idea of moral accountability, like if I was suddenly a different person, am I responsible for the things the prior version of me did? And so that's kind of an idea I've had. So I've kicked around some of those ideas. Some of them are written, some of them are partially written. So I tend to write a lot across projects until something really grabs me, and I'm like, oh, this is what I'm going to finish, and then I kind of go with
So you don't have any deadline. You're on your own. You can do whatever you.
it. Until I'm under contract, I have no deadlines.
Hmm. I'm Jill. I'm the
Okay,
person
Jill. I
on the.
wasn't sure who it was. Yeah.
Oh, it's Jill.
Okay.
I like the last one, the last thought. I thought that was interesting of your ideas. But did you ever read the book Defending Jacob by William Landy?
That I have not read, but God, why do I have? I think somebody mentioned that to me once. I might have it here.
Everybody likes it. That's one we all go back to. But he wasn't allowed to finish the way he wanted to end it. The publisher wouldn't let him, and he will never reveal it. So maybe that's what, I don't know if people knew that, but it was really an interesting read. He was defending his child, his son.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I worked for lawyers 20 years, but they were litigation. But I did work with Robert Gottlieb, the criminal lawyer in New York City.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know Rob?
I do not
criminal?
know him personally. No.
Okay. Yeah, but but attorneys I worked for, he became a judge, family court in Nassau County on Long Island. But I worked for a litigation firm too. But yeah, you're very charming. You're very convincing.
Oh,
Yeah, excellent.
thank you.
Excellent interview.
Thanks, Jill. Well, it's very hard. I guess when you're thinking about the legal system, there's so many nuances. So John Grisham, of course, he's like famous for writing these things.
Mm.
You know, so you don't want to be look like a copycat. um, it's very difficult to try to get something that's original, different, that will appeal to people.
Yeah. No, I think honestly, I just focus on things that are interesting or fun for me to write. I think in terms of this book, it was interesting and I was really working through, I think, a lot of just, deep thinking about who I was as a father and a son and a lawyer and what are my duties to society and my children, but also like the legal system in general. It was like a lot of deep thinking. It was a very hard novel to write, and I wanted to make it real in the sense of telling the truth about these particular characters in a way that would be, true to who we are as people, humans. We're all flawed, and maybe we're trying, and maybe some are trying harder than others to be better. But for John's story, I really wanted to think about, like, what if I didn't have the tools that I've had and been lucky to have as a man, right? Like in terms of just therapy and friends and family and people who love me. What if I felt like super alone? And what if I did every worst choice I could make, And I really got into that headspace because, you realize, especially when you do the kind of law I was doing for a long time, which is you see people who tried to start an investment fund, for example. They wanted to do right by their investors and then somehow ended up stealing from them, but maybe they really did want to help people make money, right? They were trying to do a good thing and then things just went sideways. And you think about the thin line sometimes between right and wrong and people making good choices and bad choices and how thin it is for all of us. Um, and anyway, I thought it was an interesting thing to think about. But maybe I want to do something, a little lighter.
I personally enjoy character-driven books, but some people like plot-driven. I have a friend who can't stand that I'm interested in the characters, which she's interested in the plot. But that's what makes us readers, I enjoy the plot also, but I love what makes people, or if I can find myself in a character and they succeed or they, things happen to them. So I always compliment the author that they're able to do that to me as a reader. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I found the book rather a mistake with the entire plot that the family wanted to investigate, because the family knew once he had the trial, he was convicted before the jury found him not guilty. And most criminals, and I've handled a few cases more than I want to talk about, they're waiting for the person to leave the courthouse so they can kill him, that he was that type of person. So I didn't find that anybody ever took the fact that the person I was representing could be innocent. They all saw, well, the jury, when they were successful, made a mistake. So even when they're found not guilty, they have a tough time walking out of the courtroom because their own family wants to murder them. I've had a few rapists that had that problem, and I could say more than one case where I was sure they were guilty, and that was the reason I was able to get a not guilty verdict. I knew exactly where the error would be made by the assistant district attorney. So being a criminal lawyer is a difficult proposition because you have to still come home to your own family, especially if you're hired by somebody in the neighborhood or somebody who's your family knows.
Oh,
it's not an easy part. So I found the book, once we got to about 100, page 100, I put it down because I knew where you were going to go. Now I'm going to finish it in a day or two because I have other problems that I have to address. In fact, I missed most of this because a neighbor knocked on my door who was involved in something. So you never can walk away from it, and these families can't walk away from the crimes. That's what I wanted to point out, that it affects the whole family. It's not just one person. and they all make their own conclusion, and they're usually coming up with he's guilty. Very rarely did I have any family that paid me, and they all paid me because I wasn't legal aid, and they paid a lot of money, but they never thought they were innocent.
Yeah, no, I absolutely think that, and I've said this in other places, and I think you probably would agree that like acquittals on some level are really incredibly deep tragedy because it either means somebody who did the crime has gotten away with it
Right.
or an innocent person's been accused of the crime. But on the other hand, and this is the duality of a lot of what we deal with in this country and in our system, it's an incredible triumph, right? Like wherever a jury sits, they're protecting liberty, right? They're making sure that people in the state are putting the burden, meeting their burden before they take away somebody's liberty,
Right.
right? It's such an incredible role, the juror and the jury, and so important. And I think that um, I wanted to address that. And in terms of criminal defense lawyers, to Irving's point, right? Like these are, if you're a criminal defense attorney, whatever lens you view the police and in, a vast majority of the time there is probable cause to charge the person is
Yeah.
likely did something, um and so you have people who spend a career going up there and trying again. Sometimes the best you can do is I'm going to minimize the potential exposure here that you have, but sometimes we have a system that's built on and people who have to stand up there representing, as Irvin said, somebody's accused of rape. And what does that mean if you somehow to squeeze an acquittal out of that? That's a weird thing to go to kind of struggle with, I think. And that kind of story has always fascinated me. And
I'm going to interrupt you. I had two rape cases where they were offered deals that they just could walk out. They both refused it because they knew the family was waiting to kill them when they would get out of that courtroom. They were afraid to leave the courtroom. In other words, being found guilty was their protection.
yeah, no, and
Yeah.
actually, I wrote an essay in Crime Reads in August, that talks to bring together two parts of this conversation. John Grisham, A Time to Kill is is one of his huge novels, right? And if you look at that story, and particularly the movie version of that story, I as a lawyer and somebody who cares about the rule of law, um, you know, it's a deeply disturbing story in a lot of ways, right? He gets the acquittal of this man who's murdered the people who assaulted his daughter, and it's a weird thing because he gets due process as the murderer of these two men who he denied due process because he kills them before their trial, right? He doesn't wait for their acquittal; he kills them coming out of the arraignment. And so when you look at that story from a lens of like, what does this mean? What is it really saying? It can be really disturbing, even before you get to the race aspects of it all.
True. What do you think about jury consultants?
Waste of time.
Oh, okay.
They're sitting there lying to you. The people that want to get off and the ones that want to get on. So you got two reasons not to have them. What you got to do is figure out who's dumb enough to be stuck there, and maybe they won't be able to figure it out.
Right. But the Eastern District and Southern District, they don't have. You're not allowed to have a jury consultant. And that's where all the money would be. Someone to pay a jury consultant. A regular person could never afford to have a jury consultant if they're paying an attorney.
A jury consultant sits down with the lawyer, and they work out what they want to see if it works. The lawyer tells them they want part of the story to go to him. Let's see what works. It's not the jury consultant that tells the lawyer anything. The jury consultant is now given the problem, and then you put a group of people in a room and you see what they kick around, not knowing that they're being listened to so that you can see what their ideas are when you're going to pick a real jury. So
Oh,
it
okay.
really is a question whether you're fixing the case or not. Not that
Okay.
they're
I
helping you. You're trying to find out if I go this way or that way, what's the result?
right.
So
Okay,
it's a
Reginald
way of
has raised
fixing
his,
a case.
okay,
Mm.
Reginald raised his hand. Did you want to put something in the chat or do you want to speak?
Yeah. Um, so so there was just one more thing I had coming into this thing. Just I had two questions coming into this thing. The first one was the one about the writing process. The other one was also about the writing process a bit. So John's a lawyer, Jane's a lawyer, Brendan became a lawyer. But Hunter became a reporter, and I found that interesting because I mean obviously it served the plot because he could do investigative journalism, but also I'm curious. Did you what was that also a write what you know thing? Did you have experience with reporting, or I mean, you had some experience with the newspaper, but was that like also like you since you knew a lot of reporters, you're drawn from
Honestly,
your experiences there?
yeah, no, that was the one place where I knew the least.
Mhm.
I've met reporters in my life. My wife worked in television news before law school. I've met other folks who have worked in and around journalism. So I chose him to be a reporter because, excuse me, I wanted there's the technical aspect you pointed out. I wanted him to have investigative skills as well as Brennan. But I really wanted them to be concerned with the truth, right? When you think about the traditional truth finding functions in our society, there's the legalist part in the trial, and they're trying to find truth, right? But then there's, in theory, journalism. I think we've seen journalism change over the last 20 years, perhaps, in ways that are not necessarily dedicated to an objective truth finding exercise any longer. But um, it enabled me to think about kind of the way the truth finding function works in those professions, and just I mean society in general, right? There's a story Brennan tells in the book about her friend, and this idea that everybody thinks John's guilty, or whether he's forgivable, and there's this idea of even the public, right? What is the truth finding function of us as a public when we consume media and news and legal news, and what decisions do we make, um, and how accurate are we versus the legal system or journalism, and what does it mean when we're not accurate or accurate? And these are things I was trying to kind of play around with.
So compared to the others,
Victor,
Hunter required more research.
Yes and no. I think you'll notice that I didn't get that deep into the war corresponding part of it, in terms of other than that he was there. I mean, I've known people who have
Sure.
covered foreign wars, so I have a sense of like what they did and what their job was, but I didn't have to get into like the methods he employs or things like that in that concept. And then obviously reporters switch beats, so and most people do not start off getting shipped off overseas, so he probably started on the local desk, and so I use that, and the same way reporters develop sources that I'm familiar with, and what they do.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, I did. I mean, there's research and there's research. Like when people talk about research for a novel, there's things I researched in the novel. I did go back and look at the history of Asian American lawyers and tried to figure out like how many were there in big firms in the late 80s, early 90s. When was the first Asian American lawyer barred in New York State? And I did all that research. Not that that ever made its way into the book, but I got it way into it. I went down that rabbit hole. And then there's the
When did
research.
that happen? That is interesting.
Oh
About
man,
what year?
I have now
When
forgotten.
did
I want to say sometime in
80s, 90s?
it was in the late, yeah, maybe the late 1890s or early 1900s. It was around the turn of that century. I just can't remember the exact date. I have a note somewhere, but I no longer remember.
Interesting. Never thought of that. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's actually the history is really interesting, and there's some really interesting articles about it. Um,
Hmm.
but if you look at research from a broader lens of like, what's my lived experience and the things I know for a fact. So like the stuff about the way law firms worked back in the early 1990s, some of that wasn't so different from when I started practicing law in the early 2000s that I knew from just stories people told me or things I experienced myself. And then for to kind of round it out, I interviewed people who were a generation older who had practiced in law firms and said like, what was it like? So there's stories John tells about things people say to him at his law firm, and from interviewing people, those were all true stories. Like those are stories other Asian American lawyers told me about practicing in the early 90s, late 80s, and things people said to them when they were working.
We're almost at, okay, Jill, did you have another question?
No, no. I thoroughly enjoyed this.
Yeah, I think that this is a book that, sometimes I was telling Victor, sometimes we can kind of like race through some of the books that we read, but this is something that is a lot of depth and it takes time to read. So
and definitely, yeah.
Yeah, I will. I want to thank Victor for taking the time to talk to us. We're getting close to the hour, so if we have any other last questions, please feel free to ask. Then
I would like to answer about the reporting on many of the criminal cases. What happens is the reporter runs in at 4:30 and asks people what happened today. He has no idea of the trial. He didn't sit there, and most of the trial is done in conferences that nobody knows except the lawyers, because there are things that we call
sidebar, yeah,
or that we don't get into, that we don't want the jury really to know about, and we're giving a trial is really something that you're trying to obscure the facts, not bring them out, because if you really analyze it, both sides, whether civil or criminal, know the answers, except they can't come to an agreement that their client is satisfied with, whether it's the government or the individual member of society. So they all go in gambling. It's not really a gamble because the investigators have now rigged the case before you get into the courtroom. And that's the way it works.
Well, I have to say, Irving, that was very cynical.
Well, I had over 100 major cases, had 10,000 clients, and I tried cases all over the country. And the most amazing part would be my entire investigation would be in Burger King, because I would go into a strange community and I would ask a few minutes before the trial, what do you know about this? And they almost would tell me all the information I need.
Before we end, Reginald had a suggestion for you, Victor, that he says you should combine all three of your thoughts and do us, what was it, cybernetic John Wicks at a boarding school.
Yeah, I saw that and I gave him the little emoji because I didn't have a chance to come back to it. So I'm glad you raised it because I thought it was funny.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. I'll keep an eye out for your next book, whenever that might be. And it'll be, I'm sure it'll be something that we'll enjoy.
Yeah, I enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. I'm going to stop the recording.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Have a nice night.
Okay.
I'll see you next book.
And I'm going to